Okay, first of all, my name is Carl Cole. I'm 63 years of age, and I am what we call one of the generational guys here in D.C. On both sides of my family, both maternal and fraternally, have a long history here. On my mother's side, which is the more extended side of the family, my mother's mother was a Quander, which gives us a presence in this region dating back somewhere between 1650 and 1680. The Quanders are the oldest documented African-American family in the United States. On my father's side, they're originally from Virginia, but have also been here for several generations here in Washington. I myself was born at Freedman's Hospital, class of 43, and I cite it that way because we do have an association of Freedman's babies that includes mayors, doctors, lawyers, engine chiefs, and a few others, and we occasionally get together to celebrate that connection. As I stated, I grew up here. When I say here, actually on this street. When I was born, I was living at 342 I Street Southwest. That's where my parents were. My father's parents lived at 312 L Street Southwest. So this basically was my turf, my territory that I hung out in, played in the streets and alleys. It was a very unique place to grow up in. A large family I come from. I'm one of 12 originally. I have 8 surviving siblings that are alive today. But all of my early years, educationally, socially, and all, were spent here in this area of Southwest.
Tell us a little bit about the rest of your siblings. Where did they go off to?
A number of them remained here in Washington. Of course, you did the military thing for the boys. The ladies all stayed here in the region, as does most of my surviving siblings. My mother's mother taught school here for many years. She was a graduate of a place called Hartstone College. Today you would know it as Virginia Union University. She was also one of the earlier members of a number of sororities and things. My brothers, we were typical boys growing up in an urban center. They are still spread about. My oldest surviving brother, though in a nursing home, we get together and still reminisce about that. He worked for the district for a number of years. I have another brother, a middle brother, Donald, who's a minister in Maryland. And my youngest brother, Edward, is now retired from the D.C. Department of Corrections, where he has worked as an officer for a number of years. My sisters all had, typical jobs that were available. And keep in mind, when I say that were available, I was raised at a time here when certain avenues for African Americans were somewhat restricted, should we say. That's a nice way of putting it. So some of your career paths in certain areas were limited. But they did the usual run of government jobs and things like that, most of whom are retired, except for my youngest sister, Sydney, who still teaches school here. I see here, I'm just looking over your sheet here, and maybe I should just follow this. It'll help you along here.
No, that can be deceiving.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about your parents, your father. What kind of a person was your dad?
My dad, my natural father passed when I was 4. But I have such a strong impression of him, I can still close my eyes and visualize him. A unique guy. My dad was a laborer, worked on the walls here, worked as a plumber's assistant, was most noted because he was a jazz piano player. Let's say that he played at some of the grander venues here in Southwest, and I think we'll let it sort of go at that. But I still remember him and remember him well. I even remember one of his closest associates, Mr. Pat. And one of the thrills that I sometimes sit down and reflect on, I knew when my father was coming home in the evening. And if you could sort of just close your eyes and you cut 4th Street all the way through to M and down to Fort McNair, and then you go over to midway in the block of I Street, you had an alley that basically ran from M Street all the way up to the railway tracks. And in the evening, that was the route that my dad would take to come home. And of course, there was always the big race around 5:30 to run there and greet he and Mr. Pat, both of whom have passed. But Mr. Pat's wife, Miss Marilyn, survived up until the early 80s, and I kept in close contact with her. But quite a guy, just a normal, normal working guy who took care of his family.
Did you say that he worked uptown?
No, he worked basically here as a laborer in Southwest. He worked the wharf, as did a number of the men in this area here. They worked the wharf area, keeping in mind there again that there were very limited job opportunities, not just here in Lower Southwest, but in Washington in general. Even for some degreed African Americans, your choices were somewhat limited as to what you were permitted to do and could access. I remember my father's brother also, who only passed 20 years ago this coming fall. His name was William Thomas Cole. Uncle Tommy lived here in Southwest until the redevelopment, as did most of the families. And as a matter of fact, I saw his former minister, Joseph Franklin, who is the pastor of Second Baptist Church, which was one part of my family's church. We had a number on varying sides of the family. But my father also had a number of sisters, one of whom still survives today. She is 94. She is not the baby of the family. The oldest surviving sister only passed 2 years ago, Miss Virginia Newby. She passed at the age of 103. So, had quite an extensive family here. My mother was an only child, but because she came out of the Quander side, she had an extensive family connect to various families here in the regions, the Kings, the Johnsons, the Coates, and so on. So,
What was she like?
my mom was, let me tell you, we called my mom behind her back Jack Johnson. She was the nicest lady in the world, so long as you carried yourself and performed the way that you were expected to. Absent that, she could be a dictator. And you know how it is, young men. Parents want you to do everything you don't want to do. Hasn't changed. It was very much that way when I was young. I think the greatest thing I could really say about my mom is the simple fact that I'm glad she was that way. Absent that, I am not exactly certain how my life would have turned out. Dictatorial, demanding, restrictive with respect to where we could go, restrictive with respect to the way you would present yourself in public. And this is not a criticism. I see you young guys sitting here in your undershirts and in jeans and in tennis shoes. Had I walked into a church other than for vacation Bible school, attired like that, then I would have been severely reprimanded and punished, because those were things that were not acceptable in the African American community, not just here in Southwest, but throughout the city.
Tell us, you're alluding to it. Try and sum up what you feel the values were in your household. What were the real learnings that your parents made sure that you had?
More important than learning, it was the access to literature. And I can best tell you that story by telling you an incident that happened in the fall, September of 1955. I was the only one of my sibling groups that was permitted to attend school, an integrated school here. My grandmother, as I indicated earlier on, was a college-educated woman. However, she too had her biases. My grandmother was reluctant to have her children to go to school with white kids. She had a fear that it would dilute me intellectually, socially, and culturally. And you know, you hear your parents say this and you wonder just what are they talking about? Well, I'm in Jefferson Junior High School. This is my first year. I'm a 7th grade student there. And they start giving out books. And they give me a book and I look at the book and said, gee, that's nice. I read that when I was in the 5th grade. Well, in those days, you raised your hand, you addressed the teacher as ma'am or sir and what have you. And I started to tell the teacher that I've already read this. Times being what they were, there were a few invectives floated at me and suggestions, at which time I was asked to leave the classroom. I was sent to the school office. Of course, I was dismissed from school. I was given a note to take home. Your son has been impertinent, he's insulted a teacher and so on, and we suggest that you not bring him back. And so my mom questioned me under lights. Tell me exactly what happened. My mother made me explain to her almost 30 times exactly what happened. Because what she wanted to be assured of, first of all, was that I said nothing disrespectfully in response to the teacher's questions, no matter what she had said. Had she called me nigger? Okay, you still would, yes ma'am. You left that to adults to resolve. I explained it to my mom. She said, okay. She goes up to the school the next morning. Hugh Stewart Smith was the principal of Jefferson Junior High School then. And it was very interesting because she only wanted to speak to the teacher. He said, well, Mrs. Cole, if you'd come in and sit down and we could talk this. No, I just want to speak with the teacher. So this goes on for a few moments. So finally they bring Mrs. Hepting in, who was the teacher, and she looked at Miss Hepting and she says, look, whenever one of my children tell you that they have read something, please rest assured they had read it. Now there may be things which you think we may be lacking in, but the one thing we do not lack in the Cole house is literature and access to literature. My children read, they read extensively. And that is the greatest thing that my entire family gave to me. I live here in the city, I live in the Farallon section. I have a 3,000 book library in my home today. So that was the most important thing. And guess what? Having that access made education easy. Because they didn't say it, they just said that of all the things that you can do, the most important will always become literate and read as much and as often as you can. And I'm so glad they did. It made the rest of life, not without its trials and tribulations, but it made it a lot smoother for me, a much easier path being literate.
Tell us how in the neighborhood of Southwest that you grew up in, that the folks dealt with that as a community. That racism, that institutional suspicion that you would always be subject to in trying to be part of the mainstream of the culture. How did the community as a whole deal with it?
Well, first off, I never felt discriminated against. It's interesting, and I have to preface it by saying this first. I never understood what integration was all about. I'm 63. And I'm still trying to figure out what integration provided me. I lived what I tell people today, and I was raised in the world's finest community by some of the greatest people I've ever known in my life and will ever know in my life. The area that, and growing up here, when you're a child, you don't pay too much attention to what others call being discriminated against. You're a child, you're about having fun. We played with everybody, whomever was there. I'm sorry if we needed the 9th man for a baseball team and you were the 9th guy and you happened to be black. I'm sorry, you're going to play ball. On the higher level of the adult world, when I think about it, what was probably existing and happening around me, discrimination-wise, I still would not have traded it for anything in the world. The only piece, and I have tons of collections of pieces from Southwest, and there's only one item that I wanted to bring with me, and I'll pass it around a little later for you guys to look at. It's a photograph. of some of the members of a place called Mount Moriah Baptist Church, which then was at 3rd and L Street Southwest. And what I'll do to describe why I feel the way I'll do, I'll just read a few names. Minnie King, that was my mother's mother. Miss Rousey, J. Harvey Randolph, the pastor, Constance Burnett, Gertrude Howard, Katie Huey, Miss Florence Warren, Lillian Burnett, Onetta Rousey, Delia Cook, Sarah Coleman, James Ross, Miss Lillian Brown, Miss Lillian Summers, Olivia Rousey, and Ida Gross. Now, when you grow up with that caliber of fantastic people, all of whom were extremely brilliant, by the way, you tend not to pay any attention to all of the other things that are going on. I knew that I went to a school that seemed to have had problems, not behavioral problems, facility problems. My first year of school was at a school called Smallwood Elementary, which was in the 300 block of I Street, off of the corner of Dixon Court and I. Dixon Court was an alley that intersected H and I Street. Later that year, we were moved to S.J. Boyne, which was at 3rd and K Street. Sales J. Boyne is the correct name of the school. That was a formerly white school. I also remember that the fencing there and the playground there before we moved there was off limit to the black children in the community. But then you tend not to have noticed that. And the reason I didn't notice is that where this building sits today, there used to be a place called the Colored Police Boys Club of Southwest. Where Southeastern University is currently located, that was Police Boys Club number 4. That was the white club. It was an old frame building that sat here, but in that frame building set the life for me that I would later lead. And I'll tell you how that worked. I, oftentimes in later years, people would meet me and then they would first listen to me and they says, well, you're not from Washington. I says, yes, I am. Well, I know brothers who are from Washington and they don't speak like you. And I said, well, I'm from Washington and I'm not unique. I can bring you others. Well, you do so many things. People refer to you as the Renaissance man. Why do they refer to me as the Renaissance man? Because it's, well, here's the rule. Anybody who has more than 6 levels of involvement with anything intellectually or culturally in your life, you have to be a Renaissance man. Now, based on their knowledge of Southwest, that never happened. But in this frame building that used to be on this very site, which was the Colored Police Boys Club, along with the colored playground, which was Randall, down the street, that was the black playground in my day, is where I developed all of this. My love of the arts and opera, my love of bluegrass music and banjo picking, my love for golf, for painting, photography, which I still practice today as a hobby, my love for astronomy, and the list just goes on and on and on. All of the things that people see in me today, I acquired when I was a young man growing up here. Contrary to the popular myth that those of us who grew up in this huge vacuum of decadent behavior and crime and la-di-da and la-di-da, and I am not unique. I could get on the phone and bring to you hundreds of people. Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, guess where her family started out at? Here in Southwest. You can go around the city and you can talk to so many of the people who have quote unquote made it, all have their roots here in Southwest. So it was a very special place. That's what all of this did for me, having been raised here. And you're looking at a guy, guess what? I've danced at the White House. I've known a number of presidents. I've had mayoral appointments. Gordon Parks, the late Gordon Parks, was a contemporary of mine because one of my hobbies is photography. Well, I learned photography in the old Police Boys Club. And I've won quite a few juried events for my photography, okay? Got it here. So Southwest was a very, very unique place to me. And sometimes because of all of the misinformation that you hear, you sort of pinch yourself to say, well, maybe I didn't live that life. You know, maybe it didn't happen that way. But I get together with some of the old timers and we reminisce and we talk about it and we find out, gee, it was very much real. It was very, very real. But the thing that made it so real, the people that we grew up with, and I can't emphasize that enough. I just grew up with the finest people I'll ever have known in my life. By far the finest. And as I said, I've danced at the White House. You know, I have notes at home where G.W. Bush said, Carl, do me a favor, would you do such and such and all. I've been there, done that. But I still place the people that I grew up with here in Southwest far above all of the other exposure levels that I've had because they were just that unique.
The Police Boys and Girls Club here was what number was this?
The Southwest Club, the colored club here was Southwest. The white club was Police Boys Club number 4, which is in the building that's now Southeastern University. But ours was just known as the Southwest Club. Our colors were purple and white. And I started to bring a photograph of the last football team from that club from the days of segregation, and that was one taken in 1958. That was the year that they were forced to integrate the Police Boys Clubs here.
Did you have the same structure? You still had volunteers from the police department and other civic-minded folk?
Well, no. Back in the day, it's interesting about that. The clubs, each of the clubs had assigned to them a uniform officer. Then they had a director of each of the clubs that was a civilian who worked there part-time as a director. And in the black clubs, believe it or not, all of these were degreed people. Mr. Bowie was the executive director of the Southwest Club. Had he been born in any other day and time, oh, Mr. Bowie probably would have qualified and could have very easily have been the Secretary of Veterans Affairs rather than a clerk in Veterans Affairs. He was a college-educated gentleman. Steve Wiggins, who was the officer who was assigned, was a graduate of what is now UDC. Then it was the Miners Teachers College, which was the black or the colored Teachers College here. A guy by the name of Rub, who even with one arm was probably one of the greatest athletic instructors I've ever had in my life in any venue, and Rub could hit a golf ball like none other with one arm. You had Wayman Brown, college educated. Mr. Green, who not only taught at Armstrong High School, but taught at the Boys Club. My brother George, who attended both Georgetown and Catholic University. So it went on and on. And even with the volunteers we have, let's take going away to summer camp. The Colored Boys Club camp was number 2. That was in Southern Maryland. The white camp still exists today under the name of the Ernest W. Brown Camp, and it's in Scotland, Maryland. At our camp, we had all of these young men from historically black colleges who worked there in the summer months. They were the counselors. They worked in the kitchen. They did everything. The guy who was the young man, old Porter, that was what we called the toilet jerk, North Carolina A&T. So when you're constantly surrounded by this level of intellect, this level of broad exposure, it cannot help but having an impact on your life. You take into the fact that these people never let you rest on your laurels. You could not enter a contest today and win and say, well, that's it for me. Well, you've got to improve tomorrow. No matter what it was, if you were playing football, you could run faster or punt the ball a little farther. If you were reading 1 book a week, well, but if you try a little harder, you could do 2. So that is what all of that came to me, was brought to me via the Police Boys Club, and it was just a fascinating experience. And I knew it was right because so much of what I hear people talk about today, what I hear people trying to replicate today, been there, saw that happen years ago. My first attempt, and along with some of the people from my peer group at interviewing an adult, was a gentleman by the name of Oliver Thompson, Delaware State, grew up right down here on I Street Southwest, pro basketball player par excellence, and he came back to talk to us at the Police Boys Club, and it was about life and what we could do with our lives if we pursued literacy and education. So watching you guys just brings back to me all of that, because that's what we did. We learned extensively from the adults who had gone before us in any area. I still love to fence, by the way. That was another one of the things. And I think one of the more interesting things about all of this is that how many of you have seen the exhibit over here at the Waterside Mall? Did you know there's an exhibit in there about Old Southwest? See, I should have had you guys to interview me over there. We could have taken a walk through and I could have given you a little history lesson, because I know all of the people and all of the photographs, including my relatives. There's one picture in there where you'll see a group of adults playing basketball at the old colored playground, which was Randall. And the men used to play the boys. We had a father and sons football day here. We had a father and sons basketball day, and all of these other community events that would go on. But when you look at the adult team there that we were playing against, and then you go back through the records of DC, you'll find all of these people, well, gee, he did this, he did that, he did the other. Joe Thompson, an Olympic champion in boxing. My brother fought on the Olympic team. Norville Lee, who actually beat a guy by the name of Ingemar Johansson in the Olympics. To most of you, that would not mean anything, but I see here your pastor will explain that to you later. We had Miss Lola LeBrant, who's exhibited there. Miss LeBrant was just, she was a recreational person for the DC Department of Parks and Recreation. Another brilliant lady who taught us the value of accept where you are, take what you have for that moment, and make it work for you. And that was a clear message that I've carried throughout my life, because I've never been one to get hung up on material things. And how she taught us that is that, keep in mind, I said that everything was segregated here. The colored playground being Randall, and our recreational equipment was in a box that was only about this high and about this long. That was all of our recreational equipment. But when it was your turn to use any one item out of that box, you were taught to use it correctly and to see how far you could go with it. I still remember the metal tennis rackets that had wire mesh netting in them, the one golf club, the one fencing foil. My love for drama and theater. We used to do a series of one-act plays out of this little green box that was our recreation center. And she did it, and she did it very, very effectively. She never blamed anyone. She never put you out as being downtrodden or dispossessed or mistreated. This is where you are. This is what's available to you. Now let's look in this little toolbox and see what we can pull out and make it work, and then you can enjoy yourself. We did not have a swimming pool here when I was a kid. Early in my life, they permitted blacks to use the Haynes Point pool for 1 hour in the morning. I kid you not. If you wanted to go to a swimming pool, do you know how many of you know where Howard University in Banneker is located? On George Avenue Northwest? You know where the swimming pool at Banneker is? Sure. That's where we walked to. Because, you know, that's what you did. You wanted to keep that 10-cent car fare and use it for a soda and ice cream on the way home. But that was our swimming pool unless you wanted to go over. And our parents, being very strong-willed, would not permit us to do that. If you cannot use this pool with such and such, then, you know, anytime, then you don't use it at all. So a lot of what I am today came out of growing up here in Southwest, was a young man just like you guys, But I had the association, as I said, of just, and I will say it time and time again, of some of the greatest people, probably the greatest people I will ever have known in my life.
We're sitting on the other side of the civil rights movement, but it's interesting how you talk about this. Some folks, women, for example, often say they have to work twice as hard, be twice as smart. You know, the bar is much higher for certain people. That easily could have been argued by yourself and your contemporaries, but it seems that there was kind of a pragmatism, kind of a, you know, take what you've got. Take what you've got now. Make it work for you now. Figure out a way out of this situation. Do you think that even within the thinking of folk that you grew up with, your family, your contemporaries, that there was a sense that we're enduring this to prove ourselves, and then on the other side, all of this can go away? Or had you just accepted segregation, separate stuff so long that you were okay with it being that way forever?
Let's talk, the best way to answer that, in 1999 was the centennial year for Ellington. A lot of celebrations. But out of that year of celebration, I think the most important thing created during that time period, a great author, a guy by the name of Nat Hentoff, did a series in the New York Times on Ellington. I love that piece, and I still cite it to people today, because what he did, he started out by not talking about Ellington, the musician, the composer, the arranger, the conductor. He talked about the Washington that gave birth to Ellington, the man. When you read the history of someone like Ellington, it was never about how can you get out of this situation, how can you better yourself as opposed to where you believe the white population is. It was about how can you be the best that you can be. It was never, to me, about competing or trying to improve myself to be like someone else. It was always to broaden my own intellectual and cultural horizons and to be the best that you could be or you choose to be in your life. And the interesting thing about all of that, I read a number of histories about Southwest, and people are always suggesting that nothing good ever came out of Southwest. That was an area that was intellectually and culturally void of anything. I could not imagine any community around having, in such a contained area, such a broad wealth of intellect and cultural stuff. You know, I went to my first opera when I was 5 years of age. When they integrated schools here in 1954, I was thrust into a situation with school kids who had never been to an opera, some of whom had never heard of an opera before. I come from a time where I thought all Americans had a piano in their home, had people who could read and write music and play the piano. I thought most families sat down on Sunday afternoons and listened to the Chicago Opera on the radio, which was then sponsored by Texaco, an oil company. So that's what it was. It was never about how can I be better than the white kid around the corner or across the street. It said, how can I better myself? And that's what it was always about. And I think the best way to put that myth to bed one of these days, I remember during the days after the Brown decision in '54, Miss Davis, who was the 6th grade teacher, we had just completed our spring testing. Excuse me. Testing is not something they started up just to harass you guys. I went through the same thing, okay? And they started speaking to the students about what we could expect. One of the things that was pointed out, and I still remember it, we just got back our California stat test, and guess what? You guys far exceeded the students that you'll be going to school with or be required to go to school with over the next several years. So if you go and you look at the statistical records and you look at the achievement level statistically, which everybody seems to love to flaunt, we were way ahead. But association-wise, culturally and things, I knew how to sit at a table with full placement. I knew which fork to use. I knew what to wear. When I got to Jefferson, that was not the case. When I was in the 7th grade, my favorite book was Dana's 2 Years Before the Mass. Most of the kids in my class had never heard of Dana before. And let alone the Harvard Classics, which that particular book was part of a collection of. I still have that at home. So that's what it was all about. Competing, if you competed with anyone, you competed with yourself to better yourself. That was the main thing.
Did people talk about, I mean, obviously there was discussion about political affairs, politics, society, culture.
That was normally done away from children. You got to remember that Washington is a Southern society. Children were not privy to the conversation of adults. However, you could watch adult behavior and you could hear suggestions of things. I do remember the demonstrations about Landsbergs and so on. I remember Mr. Calhoun, my grandmother, who was very much involved in civic associations here. I remember those demonstrations. I remember being arrested for trying to eat at the lunch counter in Hex. I was about 4 or 5. Major Barrett was the chief of police here. And we would catch the streetcar up 7th Street, get off, go in. And a neighbor of ours who actually worked at the lunch counter there, this was a great scene. Very matronly, elderly black woman. And she would come out and greet my grandmother. And with the older people, it was always first name, Sis King, how are you? Sis King, now you know we cannot serve you here. And my grandmother would go on as though she didn't hear and says, oh, Lottie, it's so good to see you. This one wants a grilled cheese sandwich and this one wants this. And she would continue to order. In the meantime, you had other families there who were doing the same thing. And finally, the police would show up, of course, and people were ceremoniously ushered out into the Black Maria and you were brought back here. At which time you'd go back over to 7th Street, catch the streetcar and go back up. There were those types of demonstrations. But so many of the demonstrations were not centered around being close to white folks. It was just having access and quality facilities. If you read originally the real documents on the integration of schools here in the city, it was about access to quality facilities, not necessarily the idea that you were going to school with these young white kids and thus that would better your education. My grandmother was one who did not subscribe to that belief. So, you gentlemen you guys ask me some questions. I know you must have something. I looked over the list. You must wonder about what it was like then. I want to hear it from you. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I ran track, played football and basketball in the junior high school, and also for the Police Boys Club. Did that for a number of years. Learned to play golf when I was very young here. I also learned to sail. I learned to sail at a place that's called Fort McNair Marina. You would know it as James Creek Marina today. I used to go there and clean boats in the summer months to get some extra money. And one day, a gentleman asked me, had I ever been on a boat? Well, I'd been in a rowboat down at the Police Boys Club camp. I'd been in a canoe as a Boy Scout, but never on a big boat. And he said, well, would you like to go out? Well, he took me out. And it was a 28-foot Lancer, and I still remember it till this day. Beautiful, and I've been hooked on sailing since then. And have been around sailing, so much to the point where I actually hold a captain's license, which tonnage to it. I know how to operate tugboats and all of this kind of thing. I do it as a passion, not as a profession. And as a matter of fact, you guys remember when the Amistad came in several years ago here to DC? The first time she came in was in '02. I was her executive officer and the pilot that helped bring her up the river. because it was their first visit here, and her captain, Bill Pinkney, and I are old sailing buddies, so he asked me if I would help. So yeah, I was very much into the athletic thing, as all young men are, you know, in this day. And we had community leagues. You had the Police Boys Club, but then we had semi-pro football. Here in Southwest, it was the Cavaliers. And then up on this part of what we call the island, the white clubs had a group called the DC Merchants, and they too had their softball and football teams. You had a number of little track teams in and about the entire region. But the Cavaliers was the major adult sporting league that I was able to associate with through my brother and his playing with them and a number of other people. And I believe there's an association of Cavalier men that still get together here in Southwest.
Not many left.
Not many. If you ever get a chance to sit down and talk with a gentleman named Herbert Holmes, he could really tell you a lot more about that than I could. You were raising your hand, young man.
Excuse me, y'all was good at the job playing against club number 4?
No, the clubs, you could only play against other black teams, even at the high school level here. White teams played white teams, black teams played black teams.
Never crossed over?
No.
What were the most notable accomplishments early in life?
Most notable accomplishments? Reading as much as I do. I love reading, and I used to pride myself in the fact that I could go to the library and get away with taking out 5 books. It was a challenge at first because they didn't believe me, but then they realized that, oh, this young man is reading these books. So that was one of my great achievements, and trying to become as literate as possible. Learning about and exploring other things also would be my greatest achievements. Yes, sir.
Was there a waterfront mall?
No, the Waterfront Mall wasn't open then. M Street was out, 4th Street ran straight through. And I wish we had enough time, because you know what I would do? I'd say, gee, I have at least another hour and 15 minutes. What we should do is complete this interview over in the Waterside Mall, and I could use the backdrop of all of that. But the neighborhood was entirely different than it appears today. Basically row houses here. The only tall buildings were in the northern section. In the area around what is now the Fish Wharf and across from Banneker Circle, there were huge refrigeration plants there for the produce that was coming in. Back in the early 1900s, there was also a slaughter yard there for beef and other cattle that were brought in and manufactured and processed there. Tons of boats. If you see the way the wharf is now, well, when I was a child, produce came up by vessel every morning. It came up on skipjacks, dories, bungees, by boats. And you purchased the produce directly there. Oysters came up on schooners, basically, 2-masted sailing vessels, and you purchased directly from the vessels there. But we also had recreational vessels along there, and there was the Wilson Line. The recreational vessels are what we called excursion groups. And the black excursion group was run in the early 1900s by an African-American guy named Louis Jefferson, who actually ran his own steamship company here in Washington. He built it, built vessels, and also had several recreational places. Then when B.B. Wills came in with his group, and they started doing what we call excursions, they had a black vessel, which was the Robert E. Lee, and I have photographs of that at home. That was the black vessel. That was the only vessel. But because there were no places that blacks could get off at in amusement parks down the river, you'd sail down the Potomac and lay off of a place called Marshall Hall. And then the boat would turn around and come back. And that was it. You were not permitted to get off, disembark, and go into Marshall Hall. Much later in my life, that actually happened. But even with that, you still had African Americans who had vessels and who knew boating, and knew boating well. On the upper reaches of the Anacostia, there's a group called Seafarers Yacht Club. If you ever get a chance, I would suggest that you guys go up there and talk to some of the older gentlemen there, particularly Mr. Williams and Bobby Martin. And they could tell you much, much more than I could about blacks and the waterfront. Yes, sir?
What did you do in the summer? Did you work? You had summer there?
In the earlier years, I went to the Police Boys Club camp, to the Colored Police Boys Club camp number 2. My brother worked there, as did most of the officers in this area. So that's how I spent a lot of summers. When I became a little older, I think it was around 12 or 13, then I started working there. And I worked there until I got out of high school every summer. But away from that, we did the things what guys normally would do. We went exploring. We had Boy Scout troops down here. I belonged to one. We were always anxious to hike and tour the city, and which you guys should expose yourselves to, because until this very day, people will call and say, hey, look, I have some friends coming in. Could you tell me where Saratoga Avenue is? You know, and we can tell them, because we used to walk everywhere around Washington. We used to walk up to the zoo. We would walk out to a place called Glen Echo, which was segregated. It was a recreational park out in Maryland across the district line. But we could hike along the C&O Canal Path all the way up into that area. So we did a lot of exploring, but we made our own games. Marbles. We had more pickup baseball games than you could ever imagine. But then the Boys Club was here. It didn't close down in the summer months when the camp opened. It continued to operate, so you had whatever they were offering there, which was quite an extensive bit. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about the change in Southwest, like baseball?
When we get to that, we'll hang on to that for the next tape. Okay. Tell us a little bit about what that club was before it was used for a Boys and Girls Club, the Southwest Club.
It was, I have a photograph of it taken in 1938. It was considered to be a mansion then. And I even have the name of the family, but it escapes me right now, but I have it down on paper. But it was a frame structured building. Let's see, downstairs, and I was so fond of it, we had a large outdoor area, which was our basketball court in the back, dirt, of course, but also served as the stage area for our arts and cultural event. Upstairs, they had knocked out walls, and that was sort of our gymnasium. But we had a pool room and a ping pong room, and then the office for the administrative officer was at the rear of the building. On the lower floor, you had the entranceway there. Then as you go back, you had the shop area, which was woodworking and metalwork. We learned how to do soldering and making jewelry and all of that stuff there. The wood shop, I made my share of model planes and soap boxes that we used to make. And then to the left of that was the facilities room for all of the sporting equipment, football and everything. And then in sort of the center was the downstairs pool room where the older club members would come and play pool at.
You said that you were born on I Street, raised on L Street?
No, on I Street, my father's parents lived there. 312 L Street is where my father's mother lived.
And so you grew up where?
In this block right here. I grew up between John T. Ryan's funeral home and Walter Johnson's liquor store. Walter Johnson's liquor store was at 4th and I. John T. Ryan's was at 3rd and I Street Southwest. Mr. Johnny Marshall's printing place was across from that. Miss Sarah Smalls, a cousin of mine, had a restaurant there on the northwest corner. And I can still name the families: the Grays, the Ravnaws, the Smiths, the Howards, Dr. Jones, Miss Irene and her family, the Warringtons, the Blairs, the Fords, the Butlers, Miss Janie Reynolds, Leroy Ford, Floyd Brown, Reverend Floyd Brown now and his family, the Lennox, Ann Duty and her family, the Halls, Miss Waters and her family, the Liggins, and I could just go on and on.
You got a great memory.
No, it's not that I have a great memory, and it gives me a chance to say it again. I grew up with great people, and we tend not to forget the great ones in our lives.
Your home, your family home faced I Street?
It faced I Street. Front of the house faced north.
They were all row houses?
All
then?
row houses.
2-story?
2 stories. Huge homes.
Big homes?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Those high-rise still right there?
No, there were no high rises here. All of what you see now came about after they began the demolition. And the demolition here began in the early 50s. As a matter of fact, the first building to be demolished was 333 I Street Southwest. That was the place that was Mr. Coleman's store. It was on the corner of I and Dixon Court. And that began in the mid-50s. And then eventually they began. The first high-rise to come on board down here, it started out being Capitol Park, which is 800 4th Street, right there at 4th and I Street. That was the first. But we had no high-rise here.
4th Street was the main street through the old neighborhood.
That was the main street. It started out being 4.5 Street. And
Why
then
did they call it that?
I don't know. When you look at the history of the city and you look at some of the old plat maps, two things that had always baffled me coming out of the 1800s into the 1900s was the numbering system for the streets at one time and then the addresses. Because the addresses for streets here were really didn't fully uniformed until the late 1800s, early 1900s. For some reason, there was 3rd Street, there was 4.5 Street. And then, of course, no 5th Street, and then you would step over to 6th Street. So we never quite understood how it ended up. And also, if you notice, there's no J Street here, and we still have never fully, there are a lot of suggestions as to why there's no J Street, but no one really knows.
There was a trolley that ran 4.5 Street?
Not 4.5, the trolley ran 7th Street. I understand very, very early on there was a trolley, but by the time I was born, no, there was not. That was a bus route. The bus routes basically ran, there were the Bureau engraving lines, which ran east and west on M. You had the 4th Street line, which was your archives line, which basically ran to Buzzards Point. And then you had the 7th Street trolley lines, which would be the Soldiers Home, and then the Georgia and Alaska and the Silver Spring cars. Those were the basic trolley lines that ran there. And they, of course, they intersected. And the extreme western part or the island section of Southwest at 14th and Independence, that was the terminus for the 14th and Colorado line, which went underground under the Bureau of Engraving, and it was a turnaround there. And that area still exists today. There's a great picture out, if you guys ever get a chance. There's a movie called The Day the Earth Stood Still. If you ever get a chance, you should look at that movie because it gives you some great footage of older areas of Southwest back in the day, including the streetcar area in and around 14th and Independence Avenue.
The Day the Earth Stood Still.
The Day the Earth Stood Still. Great history. It's a great sci-fi movie, but photographically it's great documentation of Washington and particularly parts of Southwest.
Some folks have told us that 4th Street in the old neighborhood was a virtual dividing line between a predominantly middle-class, mixed community west and almost solid African-American community to the east. Is that accurate in your recollection?
No, with a lot of holes in it, it would be accurate. It depends on what one calls middle class. If you base middle class on dollars and cents or what people's social and economic income levels were, you could probably make that argument. Intellectually and culturally, no. I eventually went to school with a number of the young people from the so-called other side of the line, and believe me, they were intellectually, culturally, and shallow, as I referenced in my earlier remarks about literature and opera. It was a heavily Jewish population. We had a Greek population, and a lot of these people, believe it or not, in spite of all of that, I still see today remnants of the Levi family. Smitty, who was a police officer, ran a Greek restaurant and did so, and ran another restaurant over in Southeast up until he passed, 10, 15 years ago.
Do you know Larry Rosen?
Yeah, the Rosens. We saw some of them when we did the dedication of the trail here a few years ago, they came back. The idea that the community was divided, and the way that people normally suggest it is that there was this strict divide. Well, there were laws about segregation, but I tend not to pay much attention to that because people normally have associated with their own intellectual and social class, no matter what the laws would say. And if you were one who had interest in books, then you hung with other people who had books, and so forth and so on. As far as the ethnic and racial divide, that's something that's very, very human. Unfortunate, but it's true that even if there were not laws on the books, we humans tend to feel much more comfortable with what we believe are our own kind, and we never have reached this point, even though we're much better educated, where we can just look at humanity as, period, as being the only kind. We just tend to do that. It's like young people hanging with young people and not with older people. We tend to clump ourselves together for varying reasons that way.
Others have made a significant point about the alley culture of Southwest. Some of the homes in certain sectors of this community that shared, backyards. You remember all of that?
Oh, sure, remember it well. I don't take it to mean anything. There's so many myths. Yes, there was an alley culture here, but then there were alley cultures everywhere in the world. The alley cultures of Europe would far eclipse anything that we ever thought that we had here in America, and far more decadent. They existed at a time when everybody and a number of people lived in alleyways. That was true from Georgetown to Upper Northwest, and this is Old Center. And a lot of you have to understand how the city sort of developed. Let me explain it this way. In Old City, Washington, which is the area south of Florida Avenue, down to the Potomac River, and then from Georgetown going over to the Anacostia River. That's Old Center, Washington. Well, the street grids there gave birth to more or less the alley. When you get into some of the outlying areas beyond those, then you would not find that there was an alley culture. Some of it came about as a result with the influx of blacks and others coming here after the Civil War. But to a greater extent, it already existed because a lot of the immigrants were coming here were from Europe. Well, there's already been an established history of alley cultures there. Here again, you have, that was an easier way and an affordable way for people of like culture, ethnic and racial groups to come together and find an affordable way of living. But even when I tell people that, I must also remind them that I could name quite a few doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs, including a few assistant superintendents of public schools who came out of alley dwellings here in Southwest.